Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Azure podcast. I'm your host, Evan Baslik, joined by the regulars, Sajit and Cynthia. Although we've seen less of Cynthia recently since she's working hard at school, but we are glad to have her join us today. This is episode number 457, being recorded on April 24th, and we're going to be talking about Data API Builder today. We've got our special guests, Ayush, David, and Sean joining us. But before we do that, let's get to the news.
Yeah, I have a few that I can cover on AKS. Everyone knows that's my favorite topic here. And so with AKS now, Kubernetes version 1.26 is just now being supported on AKS. So if you use AKS today, be sure to, and you want to take advantage of the latest, you could upgrade to 1.26. The second one is the public preview of the service mesh add-on for Istio. Istio, it's a popular sidecar mechanism in AKS, and if you need to have that service-to-service communication within your AKS cluster, you can install this particular add-on. And then finally, one of the problems with having these new versions of AKS is that at some point you want to make sure that you're on a version for some period of time, right? Like, otherwise Microsoft may decide to roll off a version, and then now you're scrambling to kind of certify your apps on the new version. So they're now starting to implement this long-term support option starting from Kubernetes 1.27. And so, you'll have like a 2-year support window for a specific Kubernetes version starting from 1.27. You can pick a version and say, that's what I'm going to use for the next couple of years. So you don't have to kind of struggle with that upgrade along with the applications.
Yeah, actually, Sajit, we've actually got the team that built that coming on, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks. I was talking to them last week because I mean, that's huge. I hear customers struggle with that versioning problem all the time with AKS. It's a pretty fast clip if you're just working it the way it is.
Yep.
Are we talking about the new like two-year support cycle for AKS?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I stole your thunder, Kendall. Didn't realize you were going to jump on.
No, I saw it on Twitter and I was like, okay,
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's all I have. Thanks.
So along the lines of the AKS, sticking on AKS for a sec. So the node resource group lockdown feature is coming out. As y'all know, I live on sort of the broken side of the world, and we regularly see customers inadvertently break their node pools. And what this allows you to do is actually lock down the resource group so that nobody can change it except for the AKS service itself. I'm actually sort of surprised that wasn't there on day one, but it's a nice add for that. A couple of the things, in-place scaling for Redis caches, which is great, right? That used to be that was something you had to do sort of on the side. Now you can do it in flight, and then we'll swap over to the newly scaled stuff. The other thing, and we've had this at Azure for a while. I actually didn't realize that we didn't have this for the desktop experience in Azure, but you can do what's called hot patching, right? So you basically update your binaries in place and then you restart the process. We've had this for Azure hosts for quite a while now. A couple of years ago, we released it for the I forget what it's called, like the nano version of Windows Server, where you've got no UI that goes with it. But now, if you're doing an Azure VM with a desktop experience, so a UI, you can do that as well. So you can be working along on your Azure VM and doing whatever you're doing, and it'll get patched. The guest OS will actually get patched underneath you, which is awesome, right? With no impact to you, right? That really takes it, sort of all the classic Windows stories of like I am reboot all the time. It's still a thing sometimes for sure, but it's less and less every day. So Kendall, anything you wanted to hit on?
Oh, I just didn't know. I didn't know if y'all had done the container apps updates because they had like a big launch.
No, we had not. Feel free.
Okay. Yeah. So this is something that I'm super excited about just because the team was working on this sort of like around the time that I left, and they've launched it, and it's great. But they came out with a lot of updates. So one of which, if you're the kind of customer that needs user-defined routes and basically no public IP addresses, this was like a big request. So support for UDR came out along with /27 subnet support, which is a lot smaller than the original asks. And another thing that they released is essentially like a new plan type. So the service is consumption based right now, right? So you get that kind of serverless scale, the ability to charge based on like CPU and memory, those kind of things. But the service also now supports this more like dedicated plan as well. You can run it within the same environment though. So when you go provision in container ops environment, you can run both consumption-based workloads and then also have more of like the dedicated approach where, hey, I need this to run on like GPUs, or I want to have like dedicated compute for this particular application. And what's nice about that is like they can run in a co-located fashion. So you don't have to go create a new container ops environment with a new underlying dedicated hosting plan. So I think that's really great. I'll drop the link to the more comprehensive overview. But yeah, with the drop of this new announcement, they came out with a lot of other things as well. And I saw it recently too. I don't know if y'all are aware, but they did start posting their roadmap more publicly, similar to what AKS does, which was a big request from a lot of people. Yeah, and if you take a look at that, they have Key Vault support for secrets management, which was something that was like a big hotly requested item, right? Being able to back up your secrets with Key Vault, and then some other things like the ability like for Terraform support, which was like a big ask. So yeah, I'll drop that link in the show notes as well. But kudos to that team for the big drop. And I personally am such a big fan of being able to run both of those kind of workloads in one environment versus like having to provision, a separate, a whole separate plan, a whole separate environment. So thought that was cool.
Yeah, nice, great. Well, cool. Well, so the news out of the way. Let's get over to our topic at hand.
I have two more. I have two more.
Oh, sorry, Cynthia.
Items. One is just a reminder for everyone that is still running app service environments V1 and V2. They are retiring on August 31st of 2024, and there are a number of resources on how you can migrate to ACE V3. It has much greater performance and a lot of new functionality. So,
and you can there's actually a migration tool these days as well for that.
Yes, but I think there are also some prerequisites. So there are a number of different paths of how you can migrate, but depending on like how you're currently using ACE-V1 or ACE-V2. And then the other one is there's an event called Unleash the Power of APIs that will have a number of different speakers from Microsoft, and I think also some outside of Microsoft as well, to talk about what are all the different ways that you or your customers can use APIs to empower your businesses.
Nice. Awesome. Okay, great. Cool. So now speaking of APIs, so data API builder, Ayush, David, Sean, do us a favor, introduce yourselves, and tell us what you do at Microsoft, and then we'll get into learning what this cool service is.
Yeah, let's go alphabetical order. Go, Ayush.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, hey folks. Yeah, so I joined Microsoft and the data API builder team, I think back in February last year. So it's been over a month since I've been with the data API builder team. So like what we are building is, just some stuff which might, seem simple, but solves a lot of problem and saves a lot of time, providing modern GraphQL and REST endpoints so that, the adoption of Azure databases becomes easier. And so the data API builder team, I think the work inside the team is something, which is very innovative, and, it keeps you interested all the time. So, I mean, as a developer, there is always something interesting coming up, as we have the roadmaps as well now, since we are public as well. And so, since we are, kind of in initial stages, so there is always some new announcement, requested by, maybe public or that we thought of ourselves. So there is always, there is the extension of the existing functionality that we have to do. So yeah, I mean, data API builder team, I think the work is cool and the team is cool. And yeah, so I'm excited to yeah, work for data API builder team, and yep.
Okay,
David,
so
I think you're up.
I guess it's my turn. So I'm the PM, Davide. I'm the PM for the data API builder. Data API builder, just Ayush mentioned, is a tool that allows you to turn your database into API, REST and GraphQL specifically. It's open source, and basically the goal is just, in quote, just to make sure that as a developer you don't have to write the same maybe not so funny to write code again and again and again, because basically what we do is just provide you an instant way to have create, read, update, and delete operation on your objects or your database objects, be them stored procedure, view, tables, and if you're using a NoSQL database, even collection. So it's something that we thought it would be useful for developers to be as efficient as possible and spend more time doing the more fun stuff instead of just basically sending data back and forth from database, which may be not super funny work, but still needs to be done perfectly because performance are everything there, right? With security in mind and all the usual stuff that, again, I would say as a developer myself, yeah, it's fun the first time you do it. The second is meh. The third is like, whoo, again. So that was the idea of Data API Builder. And if anyone is interested, you can just go to aka.ms/DAB, and then you can download the source code or read the documentation and everything. Up to you, Sean.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for handing off to me. I'm really happy to be here today. I've been an engineer on the Data API Builder team for the last about, I want to say, 1.5 to 2 years. Been at Microsoft for a little over 6.5, so have been in my fair share of roles at Microsoft, and really excited to be here today. And I'm sure Davide and Ayush have given a pretty good introduction about what we've been building.
Nice. Well, I'm going to start with the. I may not be obvious, but for me, when I first saw Data API Builder, so I go way back to the early days of Azure, and I remember this thing called SQL Server Data Services, which is sort of the early version of SQL Azure. And when I saw this seems very familiar, right? You take your database and you wrap it in, the ability to make, graph calls and
Yep.
whatnot. Is this sort of that concept leveraging modern technology and modern API structures? Is that the vision? Is I don't have to worry about writing all this input and output. I just have my data and wrap it in the API Builder. What's the thinking there?
No, I think that was the goal when we started. So make sure that as a developer, you don't have to worry too much about database anymore, in the sense that probably 80% of the use cases that you are normally writing is just a CRUD operation, right?
Yep.
I would say, like, of course, there are exceptions, and for those, one should go the usual way. We are not removing the usual TDS and SQL support, but for everything else, yeah, 80% is probably just reading something, writing back, executing some stored procedure, or doing some little bit more complex stuff. But it's really simple stuff, I would say. So the idea was let's use the modern technologies, GraphQL, REST, JSON, and everything to make it super easy to connect it in query databases, Azure SQL in particular, since it's one of the most used services, but all database in Azure, right? So Cosmos, Postgres, and MariaDB.
Oh, so you can do for everything.
And MySQL. So easy that as a developer, you can just focus on, adding value to your solution instead of just trying to figure out how to use every different database and how to use it properly. That's the important part for me, because it's very easy to use everything. But today, I think we live in a moment where it's important to do the thing in the correct way, especially from a security perspective. So that was one of the goals.
Makes sense.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions, mostly because I'm super interested in this, and I think it's actually really great. And I'm friends with Thomas Gavin. I don't know if y'all know him, but he works on the static web apps team.
Yep.
And I knew what he had been working on. Did not realize that this was this is a neat meeting for all of you, because I've kind of heard from his perspective what that new static web apps feature is, which, for those who are listening and unaware,
I didn't make that connection.
The static web apps database connection, actually, I'm assuming, uses the Data API Builder under the covers, which I'm just learning on this. But ultimately, one of the things that I'll start with is, if I'm coming from my previous experience, would this be something that would essentially allow me to remove an object relational mapper from my code? Like if I'm a .NET developer, I don't have to use Entity Framework. I could use this more API based approach. Is that
that's an option. I think we were thinking more for first most to JavaScript developers, right? When you build your front end, and then you just in quote again needs to connect to the database to get a list of items that you want to publish. before you add the two, there was no choice to create an Azure function if you're using static web apps or deploying a web app and basically writing the code, maybe using Entity Framework to build the entire query and result structure, right? And then if you want to add pagination, filtering, sorting, and all the other stuff that Sean and Ayush can discuss more in detail, again, it's a lot of work. It's really a lot of work to make it properly, right? The idea now is that you can just treat your database as an API. So it's perfect for a front end, but also if you are building microservices, another option, of course. So I think we cover quite a lot of use cases, and especially with static web apps. I love static web apps. Everyone I met, I tell them, like, go and use it because it makes so easy to deploy an entire solution with just one Git push, right? So you have the front end, the back end, and now also database. It's just a huge time saver, huge.
They're not so static anymore.
The name is interesting because it refers specifically to the fact that they just serve HTML and JavaScript, but actually what you build is dynamic, right? So it's one of those funny names that.
Well, I'm curious, just as a follow-up to that, and I'll pass it to Cynthia afterward, is why did y'all choose to go the open source route? Just like as someone who, I work at a company called Diagrid, but we basically focus on Dapper, and Dapper as an open source project came out of Microsoft. So I'm curious, like what you talked about the Azure databases and how connecting to those in a consistent way and all that, but you made it open source first. So I'm curious sort of like why that decision was made and how that's impacted the way that it's progressed.
So the decision was really right from the start, and the idea is that this is not rocket science, although it's complex, but it's not rocket science. So we wanted to make sure that first of all, everyone can take advantage of it and can help us to go in the right direction. We started with our ideas, and you mentioned before, the roadmap is public. But we already started seeing people contributing, asking for feature, going in a certain direction. This is something that we've done, and we want to make it completely shaped on developers' will. So as a developer, you tell us what you need to be more productive, and we'll try to make it. Of course, we need to take into account not only developers' desire, but everything. But the idea is that we really want to be it is like a glove for your developer end, so it just helps you and work the way you think it should work. Sean and Ayush are actually already started working on some of the requests we have received. Actually, we were debating yesterday on a contribution we just received, which is great. I don't know, Sean, if Ayush, you want to add something, please feel free. Don't let me do all the talking. You know I talk a lot.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so one of the other motivations was the fact that in our engine, since we do support GraphQL, we are utilizing a library called Hot Chocolate, and that is something that's fully open source. And so to stay in the nature of what we're using and the tooling that we're taking advantage of, we want to make sure that we kind of stay with that mission and be open source. We get to contribute to their project. They back to us as well. So it's kind of just in the spirit of keeping everything open, and I mean, we don't have anything to hide, and it's awesome. And like Davide mentioned, already having people who say, oh, well, we have a customer that we were looking all over for a solution to get this to work, or adding a REST API for our stored procedures, and actually we see that you don't have this particular niche feature. Can you build it? And if not, I'll go build it and open a PR, and we'll go from there. So that's the really awesome part about this, and already getting community contributions.
Kind of on the same vein of these customers requesting for new features and then you all deciding what the new roadmap is going to look like. I'm assuming now a lot of people are using Copilot or even using ChatGPT for a lot of questions. Do you ever take that as a source of data as input to what you want to develop as part of your roadmap? As in, like, for instance, developers keep asking about how to do X, and then X could make their usage pattern of data API easier, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And for example, one of the things at the beginning we weren't doing. At the beginning, we were we were trying to work in an open source mode, even if we were closed, especially at the beginning when we started, right? 2 years ago, because as you know, in Microsoft correctly, to go open source, you have to do a series of steps to make sure that everything is okay, right? So we started with an open source mindset, I would say, at the beginning. And at the beginning, we didn't plan to have a CLI, which instead is absolutely loved by developers. So we added it right as soon as developers started to say, hey, we need a CLI. I want to have a CLI because that makes me more productive. So yeah, absolutely. The idea is to, of course, we have our vision, which is already quite well defined. But what is going to be next is definitely something we would like to be shaped or from direct feedback or from what we see in the market. Like every developer is having issue in doing that. Like for example, one thing is caching. Like every developer want to cache at least partially the results that they get from a database for better performance, for saving cost, for lower latency. So definitely caching is another thing that we are going to add soon. Another one that Sean is working on is Open API. Everyone asked about support for Open API. So yeah, absolutely, yeah. The idea is be very active and look at what's happened on the development space and try to be as useful as possible to just make these need to access databases, I would say, seamless as possible. At some point, you should not even bother, like, just, I need a database. Okay, open a table, create a table, open a data API builder, and you're done. 5 minutes, nothing more, nothing less. Yeah.
What's so if I'm a developer and I want to use this, what's the deployment experience like? Is this a library that I include in my code? Do I deploy a service somewhere? Like, how do I use it basically?
Yeah, Ayush or Sean, this is more like on engineering side. You want to take it? Ayush?
Yeah, so basically, since we are open source and we do publish a NuGet package, so all you got to do is to have that NuGet package installed, and you can use the dap CLI that we have, and just you have to have a config file, and just once you have that dap CLI installed on your system, you can just go ahead and start using dap.
Okay, so if I'm deploying this, I don't need to, deploy any services or anything anywhere. I'm just including this in my packages in my code, and I'm just using it as I'm writing code at that point.
Yeah, suppose like you're doing some, you just want to use this on a temporary basis on your local system. So you just go download this NuGet package and then install it and just, supply a connection string to your database and use the dap CLI to start the engine, and then you're good to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go on, Sean.
I was gonna say, so yeah, that's the first option, that you just go download the release bits from the GitHub page. On the other hand, I mean, you brought it up at the beginning of the podcast, is static web apps. So you want to open up a database connection that would spin up data API builder behind the scenes, and all you would be responsible for is writing your config and writing your front end app that communicates over that database connection, essentially either REST API or GraphQL.
Yeah.
And so deploying through Azure or deploying it locally.
Yeah. Just to make sure that everyone's get this, even though it is something that is distributed as a NuGet package, this is not a library. This is an application.
Oh, okay.
So
it is an
.NET
app
application.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is a .NET application that basically when you install it, using .NET tool. So .NET tool install Data API Builder, and you get a .NET application. Then you have the CLI. In the CLI, you just do dub start after configuring a couple of things. And basically, you have a server running on your machine, right? It's listening on the usual ASP.NET port 5000, 5001. And so you really have, if you're familiar with the terminology, I guess you are, you have a really Jamstack architecture. So you have the database, you have in this case, the backend, which is Data API Builder, and then you can create your own frontend using whatever, Blazor or JavaScript or any other technologies. And then you have these three things working on your machine, right? Then you can deploy each one. But then you will deploy database on Azure SQL, Data API Builder, or on static web apps, or in its own container. And then the front end, again, using web apps or static web apps or application, what is the new one? Oh, the container apps, if you really want to be super fancy.
Okay. Okay, so I
Yeah.
do end up deploying this into a container ultimately somewhere.
Basically, yes.
Which
Yes.
it's sort of cheating. I'm gonna pile on that. That implies I don't have to deploy it to Azure necessarily. As long as I have a container,
That's
I can
right.
run it anywhere.
That's right, and that's another thing we absolutely wanted to make sure it's truly working everywhere, because we want to make sure that developers, no matter what and no matter where they are, they can use this to be more productive. Of course, we think that the best place to run Azure Data API Builder is Azure, right? Because it's well integrated, for example, with static web apps. It will be integrated with other services in the near future. So ideally, if you use Data API Builder on your machine and then you want to deploy it with Azure, you don't even have to deploy the container, as Sean mentioned. You just deploy the configuration file that we need. And with static web apps, we automatically do everything for you. It's completely serverless. You don't even know that there is a container running somewhere, right? You just see the API. But let's say some companies asked us, oh, I need this to run in a container because containers, Kubernetes is the only thing we can run for our policies. Yeah, please go and do it. We will be more than happy to see, deployed wherever. So that's the idea.
Okay, great.
So as a developer, as you've said, we've had to build these kind of, point APIs over time, right, to access databases from a JavaScript app or something. One of the concerns that has always come up is how to limit what database actions these APIs take, right? Because obviously, if you give carte blanche access, A, the developer will shoot themselves in the foot, and B, somebody will do something in an insecure way, right? So I just want to know how you would address this, and I know you talked a lot about how secure this was. So I'd appreciate if you can also touch upon how the security comes into play here.
Sean, you want to go with it?
Yeah, so we build authentication and authorization into the product, and that was one of the first things that we wanted to design from the get-go. So you can't just have anybody and everybody sending requests to the database, and so that's from a public perspective. But then from the developer's perspective, as you asked, it's more of a providing guidance and giving an understanding of what are you providing access to in your connection string. So you don't want to just give access to everything in your database. And so that then translates into the developer designing the config file for Data API Builder. So not only are you providing the connection string and scoping down the amount of access that gives, but you then configure a permissions model within that config that you scope down roles, actions, and entity access, for lack of a better term, for what you want your users to be able to do on the platform. And so unless you have a certain role, you cannot perform certain actions, and that is enforced on Data API Builder. And that's kind of our first step to this, and that's how we're looking at it.
And just adding on top of this, when you deploy Data API Builder in Azure, you can also, of course, use managed identities. So you don't even have to have password moving back and forth. So on top of what Sean just said, that is something within Data API Builder. The other problem is how do I make sure that when Data API Builder is running and another service is calling it, maybe we can use managed identity. So that's exactly what happened, for example, again with static web app. So again, the idea is that it's our job also to make sure that the best place where to run the API Builder is Azure. But aside that, whatever Sean said will work everywhere.
So I have a couple questions here, kind of along some of the same lines. So one of them is you provide, the authentication mechanisms, which you talked about earlier, and that was a big, thought process. So I'm curious from from the API perspective, do y'all codify like some best practices into the actual API itself, i.e. like, are there default retry policies, or like, is the user responsible for still creating sort of the schema through which they make retries and those kind of things? Just curious if that's something that's baked in. Maybe to ask that.
So a question here. So when you talk about retries, do you mean like some transient failures that the user get, and there is some automated logic to retry the request?
Yeah, so I kind of mean like, maybe if I'm a .NET developer, I use Poly to retry my API calls. Is that something I still have to do, or does the API itself actually handle, like provide me with default retry policies and those kind of things?
Yeah, we do have a default retry policy, but currently that is not configurable via the config file that the
Okay.
developer uses. But yeah, depending on the feedback, we can always incorporate that thing. But
And guess what?
we have this retry policy in place.
And guess what library are we using? Polly.
Okay.
That's important to underline because we really didn't. So we wrote a data API builder as you would have wrote it. This is for us super important because allows you to, as a developer, to have the basically the confidence that this is nothing more and nothing less than what you have done. And in fact, we allow a huge amount of configuration. Like, for example, I'm very picky about the name of my routes when it comes to REST or even GraphQL objects. So you can configure everything like you would be able to do with your own stuff. So that's super important.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. Yeah. And that's interesting. And it sounds like a good move. The other question that I had that was kind of along similar lines is, okay, so I have this API, super easy to use, but what's the portability aspect from, data API builder targeting one database versus another, right? Is it as simple as changing out a connection string, or is sort of the implementation fairly specific to each one? And if I was going to make that change, it would still be somewhat of an undertaking. Like, what's the level of sort of portability / consistency when I switch from one target to another?
That's a great question. So one of the goals of the data API builder is to provide to especially companies with a very diverse and huge data estate a sort of a common API to access all databases. So I would say the data API, the API produced by data API builder all looks the same. Like if you connect to MySQL or Azure SQL or Postgres or Cosmos, you probably don't even you're not able to understand that you are connecting to some specific database because database abstract all the database complexity behind the scene. Having said that, of course, there are some features that we kept as a kind of additional value that each database can bring. Like, for example, Azure SQL and Postgres as row-level security, we want to take advantage of it. So if you're using, for example, SQL Server today or Azure SQL, you can enable row-level security at the database level, and you will be able to use it from Data API Builder. Of course, MySQL doesn't have that support. So if you start to use some specific feature of each database, then it may be harder to move from one to another. But if you just go with the common, I would say, surface area, then you can literally just change the connection string and everything will work. But our goal was, and it is really thank you for the question because allows me to highlight that our goal was not to make every database look like the same, but make sure that accessing database is the same for every type of database, but at the same time, each database can bring up its own unique value, right? So, of course, in that case, something will only work with Azure SQL and something else also only with Cosmos or the other database. But again, from a developer perspective, when I learned how to access Data API Builder, I basically learned how to access all the other databases, which is, I think, a really great value for a developer.
Yep, and just to kind of add on to that, I'm assuming that I think Sean and Ayush mentioned about the config file that you have to create. Is there some sort of a mapping that goes on between database entities and API routes or something like that? Like it's something like a resource navigator almost in the database?
Yeah, you essentially map out everything that you want to be present on your endpoints. And so if it's not in your config file, it's not accessible. And so that's another barrier to entry for the security perspective. And so just because you provide a connection string doesn't mean that we're making everything in your database accessible. And so anything that you put in your config file, so you're going to say, hey, I want this table or this stored procedure exposed. Well, maybe I want to add custom mappings or aliasing for those names. And so the REST route might be something, the GraphQL type names might be something else. And you get to change those all within your config file.
So that might be a good way to address the portability, I think, concern that Kendall had, because in another database, we had a different name. You could kind of map it to make it look like the same and kind of achieve that API level portability. Although my question was more about how performance is monitored using DAB, right? Because obviously, again, I'm thinking as a developer, I'll often do things that will wind up maybe doing table scans or whatever on a
Sajid, you
database.
never make any mistakes with your code. No, never.
Especially with like an API. Oh, look at that great API. Let me just call it. So I just wondered, like, is there some sort of a way to for the AB to kind of give you some performance stats as to what are the costs involved with each of those queries, for example?
Right. So we don't have anything built in that will report on the actual performance of those queries, but depending on the database that you use, we'll be able to provide guidance on what that looks like to go into those databases and see, okay, well, you saw that data API builder sent this query to the database. Well, what did that result in behind the scenes? And is there anything that you can do to improve indexing or anything on the database side to help improve the performance there? And then that's something that we're working on planning, is how do we make that customizable from the developer's perspective? Okay, well, maybe we translated the REST API request into a certain database query. Well, maybe that wasn't exactly what you wanted. We're looking into what that would look like to add that customization, but we don't have that today. But it's definitely something that would be useful.
Right. And just on the same note, is there like a correlation ID that you can send in all the way from the JavaScript thing all the way to the database, for example,
Yes.
so you can get that end-to-end trace?
Yes, that's right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Nice. Cool. Well, no, this is great. I started my life in what used to be called the web data team at Microsoft, where we spent, I don't know how much time we spent helping people write that CRUD code around and chasing bugs and whatnot on it. And you're right. At the first couple times it's cool, and after that you're just like, oh, this again. So I think this is great going forward. Any last sort of things you want to leave the audience with, or something you want to hit on that maybe we missed?
No, the only thing I want to highlight is that anyone listening should just go to aka.ms/dab. And also, because we also have already done at least 3 full end-to-end examples using Vue as a front-end framework or React. And so you can just go through those samples, see the end-to-end using Azure SQL, Cosmos, and I think also Postgres. So one not only have the experience of using Data API Builder, which is great, but how the Data API Builder actually fits in a more, I would say, real-world scenario or real-world architecture. And that is super easy. That's amazing, because that is really where you understand, oh boy, this happened in 5 seconds, not in 2 days. I just configure the file and it's working. That to me, every time I use it, is always like, so nice. So I really, wish people to go and have the same feeling, because it's so nice. Yep.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you all for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.